It's been quite a while since I've made content covering Genshin Impact, and the reason for that is that I've been having a bit of trouble getting hooked on the story after the whole Fiorina thing. The recent 4.7 patch, however, brought with it the continuation of the Archon story. More specifically, we get a follow-up on Dainsleif and our siblings' story, which happened way back in 3.5. We get more answers on what the Loom of Fate actually is, the secretive faction of Skirk's master, and even what the Traveler's sibling has been up to. But along with these reveals are even more questions, and of course, more theories. So in this video, we're going to talk about all the things that was revealed in the recent 4.7 Archon quest. And by the end, I'll share a rather interesting theory about one of our supposed companions, as they might not be who they appear to be. Strap yourselves in, it's going to be a long one. Before we dive into that though, if you want to see more Genshin Impact or Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. As you might have guessed, given the 4.7 patch came out literally a couple of days ago, this video will be rife with spoilers. So if you haven't done the 4.7 Archon quest, then be warned. There will be a lot of spoilers in this video. I'm going to be splitting this video into three main sections, as there were three major reveals made throughout the course of the Archon quest. The first is in regards to the Sinner, or should I say the Sinners. If you need a refresher, the Sinner was that giant block of purple crystal we meet hidden deep beneath Sumeru that we saw speaking to Clothar Alberic and subsequently inspiring him to form the Abyss Order. As it turns out, not only do we learn who it was, but it seems there are a total of 5 of them. The one we met was Vedafolnir the Visionary, who not only prophesied Fontaine's demise, but also turns out to be Dainsleif's actual brother. Then there's Skirk's master and the owner of the Narwhal, Surtalogy the Foul. The other 3 members are Hroptatyr the Wise, Gold or Rhine Daughter, and the Wrecker of Solnari Rerir. They were originally from Kynria and were esteemed individuals likely holding positions of a similar standing to Dainsleif himself, who was the captain of the Royal Guard of Kynria. Dainsleif mentions that while they did hold high positions, they ultimately betrayed Kynria and why they are branded as sinners. It's very likely, given their positions and the result of their actions, that these 5 people are also the ones who influenced the last king of Kynria, or at least assisted him, in tearing away the veil of sin and peering into the abyss, as Piero mentions in the Pale Flame artifact set. The extra thing we learn is that not only did they get their king to do this, incurring the wrath of Celestia, but they also took the power of the abyss for themselves and split it among the 5 of them. This essentially allowed them to transcend to a higher plane of power, and given Skirk's description of her master, it's likely they are at the level of Archons, if not higher, as Dainsleif describes them to have world-shattering powers. Their actions, as you might recall, is also what caused the fall of Kynria, and according to Dainsleif, they essentially just left after getting what they wanted, even though they could have easily prevented it. The realization that these 5 were likely the sages that Piero spoke of raises a rather interesting question. Up till this point, we have sort of assumed that the Tsaritsa is arming the nation of Snezhnaya to go up against Celestia, but given this recent revelation and Piero's involvement with the Tsaritsa, I can't help but wonder whether perhaps she is actually planning to go up against the 5 sinners. Dainsleif even mentions that it's only a matter of time before they sacrifice the world itself for their ambitions, and based on what we've learned, they clearly have the power to do so. This might paint a different light on the Fatui, perhaps setting them up as potential allies down the line. I mean, have you noticed that most of the encounters we have with the Harbingers have largely involved stories that in some way humanize most of them, despite them being said to be outright villains? Scaramouche has had a redemption arc, Chal is pretty much our buddy at this point, and even Perry or Arlecchino seems to be a generally reasonable person given her past. Even Capitano seems to have some code of honor and was able to talk things out with Varka, avoiding an all-out fight, and Piero seems to have good intentions in mind based on how he acted in Kynria. Perhaps the Harbingers are a red herring, meant to make us think they are the antagonists, while in truth they may be future allies against the 5 sinners and even Celestia. I mean, it's explicitly mentioned that the top 3 Harbingers are strong enough to challenge even the gods, and Coincidentally, the 5 sinners are also at godlike levels as well. Plus, Charles having to perhaps choose in the future between his master and the Harbingers might even end up as a possible storyline. Of course, they are among the Harbingers who are rather dubious characters such as the Doctor, the Regrator, and the Rooster, so they may still yet play the part of the villain. That said, given this revelation, perhaps Celestia isn't the only people the nation of Snezhnaya is arming themselves against. What's also interesting is that now that we know who the sinners are, it's also confirmed that they are directly involved in the creation of the Abyss Order. It's not necessarily a big surprise though, given they have had affiliations with the Abyss in the past, but this also means that they are directly responsible for the manipulation of the Traveler's sibling. Given the sibling is revealed to be working towards realizing the Loom of Fate plan to combat the Heavenly Principles, we can surmise this is what the 5 sinners are also planning to do. It's very likely that their endgame is related to gaining more power or perhaps transcending beyond the Heavenly Principles themselves, but let's take a few steps back and talk about the Loom of Fate, because the exposition within this quest also explains to us what exactly the Loom is. Now, much like the sinners, the Loom of Fate was something mentioned way back in 3.5. Back then, the Loom of Fate was referenced in 2 different ways. The first is through Clothar Alberic, who mentions that his son, Caribert, has become the Loom of Fate after receiving abyssal energy and is now free to chart their own course, but more on that later. Then there was also a reference to how the Loom of Fate was an experiment to create some sort of mechanical god. This is what involved the eye of the first field tiller and the old god Osial. At the end of 4.7, we actually meet up with our sibling, and both they and Caribert give us a bit of an explanation on what the Loom actually is. According to Caribert, there are 2 forms of the Loom of Fate, an incomplete version and a completed one. Caribert mentions that the Loom of Fate is a device that allows its wielder to essentially weave real ley lines, but in its incomplete form, all it can do is implant memories into anyone the wielder chooses. He goes on to say that when the Loom of Fate awakens to its true and complete form, it loses its ability to implant memories. Caribert is essentially the incomplete form of the Loom and why he is able to implant memories as we see throughout the quest in 4.7. He explains further that Tevat's leyline system is deeply entrenched into the planet, and that while the Loom can weave and create new ones, it cannot replace or extend the ones that already exist. This is the extent of his knowledge though, and further exposition is provided to us by our very own sibling. While our sibling doesn't go into how it exactly works, they do reveal that all this effort in building the Loom of Fate is to at some point in the future use it against the Heavenly Principles. It's evident that our sibling despises the Heavenly Principles due to what they did to the people of Khaenri'ah, turning them into hilichurls despite most of them being ignorant of what the sinners have done. Our sibling considers this to be an extremely cruel decision, as it essentially leaves the innocent people of Khaenri'ah to a fate worse than death, especially since we've kind of been killing the hilichurls by the thousands. I'm not sure whether the sibling realizes that she is indirectly serving the very people who caused the entire problem in the first place, though it's unlikely that they are aware. This explanation on what the Loom is and how it functions, as well as it being a tool to be used against the Heavenly Principles, has kind of made me think of another thing we've encountered. Given the Loom is a device that can weave the ley lines and in its incomplete form can implant or change memories, one particular thing comes to mind. It's something that functions almost similarly, and we've encountered it before: the Irminsul. The tree itself is said to be connected to all the ley lines of the world, can forcibly change the memories of any who aren't descenders, and is something only a few are aware of. It seems as though the Irminsul and the Loom have very similar functionalities. I would even go so far as to say that the Irminsul is perhaps the very first Loom of Fate created, and is perhaps even under the control of the Heavenly Principles. If this were true, how could one possibly go against the god of Tevat itself? The minute you mount an offensive, your memories could be hijacked and altered, making you think that you've already won, or even forget about the battle in the first place. And this is where I think the Loom of Fate comes in. It's to functionally counteract the Irminsul itself. This way, if the Abyss were to mount an offensive against the Heavenly Principles, they would be immune to the effects of the Irminsul itself. This may have been the long-term plan of the sinners. Khaenri'ah gave them powers to transcend into near godlike beings, and now they are building the Loom of Fate to contend with the Heavenly Principles Irminsul. It seems to me that our sibling is just misguided into doing the bidding of the sinners, and they themselves wish to attain a higher level of power and maybe become gods themselves. I mean, each of the sinners is a reference to something within Norse mythology, and Hroptatyr the Wise just happens to be another name that Odin himself uses. So perhaps the sinners are inspired by the legendary thirst of knowledge Odin has, or perhaps it's more similar in depiction to the Odin we see in God of War, a covetous, manipulative, and power-hungry madman. Plus, all the symbology that relates to the Loom of Fate, such as memories, reality alteration, and Norse mythology, just kinda reminds me of the ending for the Loki series, where Loki essentially takes the place of the temporal Loom and just ends up as the linchpin to the many divergent timelines and storylines that exist. At the end of that series, when Loki holds together all these different timelines, it just so happens to look like a tree or Yggdrasil, which the Irminsul is likely inspired from. Of course, I don't know if any of this will end up being canon, but it does indeed seem to give more context to what the Abyss Order and the Sinners are actually doing. Now, all of this culminates in a rather weird idea that crossed my mind. One that I hinted at in the introduction of this video, where I said one of our companions may not be who they say they are. If you haven't guessed it already, I'm referring to Paimon. Now, the idea that Paimon is the Heavenly Principles isn't a new theory. It's been around since the game first launched. There have been many different perspectives on how this idea might turn out, and I'm not trying to reinvent the theoretical wheel here, but based on what we're told by our sibling, the details so far do seem to further lend to the idea that Paimon might be the Heavenly Principles. Firstly is the fact that our sibling tells us that despite all the rules that have been broken in the past 500 years, the last time we actually hear the Heavenly Principles take action was in Khaenri'ah. Everything past that point, whether it be Raiden A giving away her Gnosis or the Hydro Archon destroying hers, we have not heard so much as a peep from Celestia or the Heavenly Principles. Now, the assumption is that the Heavenly Principles has been in a deep slumber, perhaps resting or recuperating their powers. Even our sibling seems to think this is the case, as they mentioned they haven't awakened. But what if the reason Celestia has been quiet is simply because they're not home? And in truth, they have been with the Traveler this whole time. It's not that they were dormant, they were just away. Now, you might ask, well, if they're literally a god, why wouldn't they be omniscient and know everything that is happening in Tevat? I mean, if they truly control the Irminsul, they could just binge watch the last 500 years. Well, it's possible that after Khaenri'ah, they lost a large portion of their power, and this is something that actually has precedent. Think about what happened to Greater Lord Rukkhadevata after trying to repel forbidden knowledge. They expanded all their powers and miniaturized themselves into small Devata and only had a fraction of their power remaining. Perhaps something similar happened to the Heavenly Principles and why they now appear as Paimon. But then I hear you ask, why would they be following the Traveler? Wouldn't they rather be rallying their forces against the sinners, who are clearly out to oppose them? Well, think of it like this. If they were weakened but knew that the sibling was manipulated into helping the sinners, what's the best way to track them down? You let loose the Traveler, who would stop at nothing at finding their sibling and is largely unaffected by the changes any Irminsul or Loom of Fate device can have since they're descenders. Isn't it kind of odd that Paimon runs into the Traveler shortly after they awaken? Plus, why was Paimon even drowning in the river in the first place? She can fly. And on top of that, despite traveling to 5 nations, there hasn't been anything that even vaguely resembles Paimon. She seems entirely unique. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to say that Paimon has been manipulating the Traveler into doing specific things, but up till this point, everything we have done as the Traveler has sort of put a dent in the Abyss Order's plan. A plan that, as of 4.7, seems to be something that evens the playing field between the Sinners, Abyss Order, and the Heavenly Principles. I mean, think about who stands to gain the most from the failures of the Sinners, our sibling, and the Abyss Order. It's the Heavenly Principles. You might then say that if Paimon is the Heavenly Principles, why has she ignored all the stuff going on in Tevat? She was in Fontaine when the Gnosis was destroyed, and she was there when Nahida threatened to destroy her Gnosis as well. Why not act in all those moments? It's likely because she was biding her time until her true enemies, the Sinners, make themselves known. The Archons are likely inconsequential in this fight. But truthfully, this is just a random nonsense theory I thought was interesting to include as part of this video. There's really no way to tell if it's true at all, so just keep that in mind and don't take it too seriously. There's actually quite a lot I'm omitting here as far as the theories are concerned, like how each of the sinners are influenced by Norse mythology and even the siblings' true goals. But to keep things concise, I think this would suffice for now. Genshin's story has, to me, been rather slow recently, but these reveals have definitely refreshed my interest in the overarching story. It's unfortunate that we might have to wait all the way till the end of Natlan to see how it might evolve further. I definitely think that there are multiple layers of things happening here, with the Archon story and perhaps the Saritsa being one of those layers, and the stuff happening with the Abyss, Sinners, and the Heavenly Principles being another layer altogether. Plus, we can't forget the involvement of the dragons as well, given the Dragon King is said to be returning. Anyways, if I missed out any details, feel free to share them in the comments and do let me know what your thoughts are on these reveals. Do you think the Loom of Fate is indeed another Irminsul? What do you think the Sinner's true goals are? And has Paimon really been tricking us all along? Share all your thoughts in the comments below. I'll end this rather long video here, and if you enjoyed your time watching it, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.